Well, we will get a microphone that works. Just let me set up my papers real fast. All right. How is everyone feeling today? Tired? I hear some laughing, which I imagine means that we have a variety of emotions. We're acknowledging the many realities that we bring into this space. And as I look out, I just give thanks that we can all be here together. I remember the moment when I first learned that 6 million European Jews had been murdered in the space of a little more than a decade. This monumental atrocity against a people group, while much of the world passively observed, is what we refer to as the Holocaust. I was driving with my dad. My dad's a pastor too. We were driving to the installation of a local pastor. And I remember the car that we were driving in, the seat I was sitting in when he first told me about this. Right? People were rounded up by men with guns. They were put on trains, taken to camps outside of cities, tortured and killed, all because they were Jewish. That was burned into my brain and began a lifelong study of the Holocaust, and that's what I studied in college and beyond. Yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day. Did any of you know about that? Yeah, I see some head nods. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly voted to create this day, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, because January 27th was the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And Auschwitz was one of the camps. It was the camp where most people were killed as compared to the other ones. And so, for the most part, this day is not on a lot of people's radars. We might know about it or read a news story about it, but it kind of passes by without much fanfare. For a lot of us who aren't Jewish, the Holocaust is something we remember when we watch a TV show or a movie where Nazis are characters, or when we're reflecting on why our uncle or our great-uncle fought in Europe during World War II. And yet, for many Jewish people, remembering the Holocaust is simply reflecting on their family history. Rabbi Ruhi, who's the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel here in town, has said, "The Jewish people are only generations removed, just generations, 1 or 2, from a very comprehensive attempt to annihilate us from our very existence." Because of the horrors of the Holocaust and the unimaginable destruction of humanity involved, never forget has become a kind of mantra in both the Jewish community and the world of Holocaust studies. And so these words began floating through my mind as I noticed that this day was coming up and I was preparing for my sermon. Never forget, never forget. And I began to wonder, what does this mean for us today? What does it mean for us as people of faith to remember terrible events of the past? Is there a purpose to such a depressing exercise as remembering genocide? So these questions were still in my head as I was reading the scriptures for this morning. And when I read Psalm 111, I noticed that it was a psalm of thanksgiving, primarily. It says, "Praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, in the company of the upright in the congregation." Right? That's what we just read. With words that many modern Jews still sing in the synagogue, this author is publicly thanking God for all God has done. But if you notice the last line that we all read together, It's less of an expression of praise and more like a proverb. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All who practice it have a good understanding. So, as I read it, I thought, well, this proverb is actually a good reminder, or it gives us a clue as to why we would observe Holocaust Remembrance Day. We remember atrocities like the Holocaust because remembering where humanity went wrong helps us to fear the Lord. Okay, what do I mean by that? To be clear, it's not about dwelling in guilt. The goal is not for us to fear God because of God's wrath for what humanity has done, right? That's not what I'm advocating. Rather, we remember God's intentions for the world, and we remember who we are in relationship with God. So one biblical commentator writes, the word fear, yara, appears in the Hebrew Bible as a synonym for love. So live in the fear of the Lord, live in the love of the Lord. It also can be interpreted cling to the Lord, or even serve the Lord. And so at its root, the word denotes obedience to the divine will, right? We love, we serve, we cling to the Lord and the Lord's ways. When we have a healthy fear of the Lord, when we live in a loving relationship with God, we gain the wisdom that we need to be in right relationship with one another and with other communities. When humans target, despise, and kill one another, God's will for this world is not realized. Right? That's putting it not even bluntly enough. Right? We are going against God's will. So one way that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, this is the denomination that Emmaus is part of, has helped us to engage in this task of remembering and gaining wisdom is by offering what's called declarations, statements, if you will, about our responsibility and complicity to communities that our church and its leaders have hurt. So in 1994, there was a declaration made to the Jewish community. It's called a Declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to the Jewish Community. I had Melinda actually print this out and put it in the bulletin. So if you turn to page 16 and you want to look at it with me, I'm not going to read it all out loud, but I wanted to read a little bit of the beginning and the end. And so here it goes. In the long history of the church, the treatment accorded to the Jewish people by Christians has been among our most grievous and shameful legacies, both in the contagion of anti-Judaism and its modern successor, anti-Semitism. Lutherans feel a special burden in this regard because of certain elements in the legacy of the reformer Martin Luther and the catastrophes, including the Holocaust of the 20th century, suffered by Jews in places where the Lutheran churches were strongly represented. We recognize in anti-Semitism a contradiction and an affront to the gospel, a violation of our hope and calling, and we pledge this church to oppose the deadly working of such bigotry, both within our own circles and in the society around us. And so I'd invite you to read that more fully later and maybe even check out some of the other declarations because they're good reminders of how we understand our relationship to communities that we have hurt. But this declaration gives us another clue as to why we remember. Recalling terrible human lapses in the past helps us to be clear about how our faith guides us to act differently in the future. We oppose the deadly working of bigotry in our own circles and the society around us. And unfortunately, it is all around us. Rabbi Ruchi of TBI, Temple Beth Israel, has talked openly about the fear she and her congregation have felt in the last 8 years as anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions have increased and become normalized. Hearing anti-Semitic rhetoric on the nightly news, seeing swastikas painted on the side of buildings, having anti-Semitic literature deposited on their doorsteps and in their lawns, has increased the fear of congregants of TBI, Temple Beth Israel. And the current situation in Israel and Palestine has also been very difficult for our Jewish neighbors. And so track with me here. Rabbi Ruhi has publicly said that the temple community wants all people in Israel and Palestine to live with dignity, to live with the ability to access resources to meet their basic needs, and to live with freedom from fear. And yet, this war and its widespread impacts triggers a lot. I'm not saying that to excuse any war crimes or any inexcusable things, Rabbi Ruhi says, but I am saying that to ask for compassion. As much as Jewish people all over the world deserve accountability, and we do, we also deserve compassion. That was in an interview she did with KEZI. And I would just note here that as Rabbi Ruhi has said, that Jewish people all over the world deserve accountability, we also want to be clear that it's the Israeli government that is responsible for the military campaign, right? Not all Jews throughout the world are responsible for everything that's happening there. So just to be clear, because that is one way that anti-Semitism has reared its head throughout history, is by making all Jewish people responsible for the actions of Jewish leaders. So it's difficult in situations like this, complex situations like this, to remember the wisdom of God. But this is exactly where we need to draw on God's wisdom and the convictions of our faith to figure out what it means to be more than bystanders, to be active in responding to indignities and atrocities that hurt other communities. We can have compassion for our Jewish neighbors and speak truth about God's desire for all God's people to be protected, particularly focusing on Palestinian people right now. You know, it's easy for us in all kinds of complex situations to fall into either or thinking about who is right and who is wrong. But God's wisdom leads us to ask a different question. What is right? What is wrong? Children in Palestine should be safe and be able to find food every day. People should not die because of bombings and lack of food and medicine. We want an end to war. We want an end to anti-Semitism. We want people to thrive. We want all people to be held in God's compassionate embrace. In our role as citizens of this world, we remember how humanity has failed the most vulnerable in the past in order to build up our conviction that we must speak out against the cruel destruction of any person or community in mind, body, or spirit, whether that be because of the deadly effects of war or because of bigotry. We reflect on history also, to remember that compassion matters in our everyday lives as well. Back in November, Rabbi Ruhi, in an interview, said, "Your Jewish friends and neighbors are struggling, and they may need someone to check on them." She would suggest that you check in on your neighbors who have ties to Palestine as well. There is so much more we could say about these things. I know that I did not capture everything that we should say about what's going on in the Middle East, about genocide, about atrocities in our world, and perhaps you have a different viewpoint, or that you see this situation a little differently. And so, an invitation. If you are struggling with these or other political realities in our world and what it means to respond to them as people of faith, I invite you to contact me or Andrew or Claire, because we are more than happy to be conversation partners with you. But before I sit down, I want to share with you a final reason why we remember. And this is actually a piece of a poem that I found when I was putting together a liturgy back when I was in seminary for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's called The Creed of a Holocaust Survivor by Alexander Keimel. Alexander Keimel was a Polish Jew who survived the ghetto of Rohatyn, and he escaped the final liquidation of the ghetto, unlike many of his family and friends who were killed. It can be hard for us, for anyone, to have hope in the face of so much violence and suffering. Keimel's poem demonstrates what it means to remember the atrocities of the past while simultaneously proclaiming God's goodness in the past, present, and future. And so I read to you. I do believe with all my heart in the natural goodness of humans. Despite the blood and destruction brought by one man trying to be God, in the goodness of man I believe. I do believe with all my heart that God created a beautiful world, the sun and the trees, the flowers and the bees. And the best way to serve God is to enjoy the fruits of God's labor of love. Despite the painful memories from the past and the joyful celebration of life, I believe. I do believe with all my heart that God has created us in the image of his own, and killing of people is like killing of God. Despite the massacres in Rwanda, the cleansing in Bosnia, the folly of Muslim fanatics, and the cruelty of Pol, in the love of compassion of the Creator, I do believe. I do believe with all my heart that the Messiah and the kingdom of heaven will come when all the preachers of hate will be silenced, when human will stop killing human in the name of God, and nation will not lift weapons against the nation. When it will be, I do not know. But despite all the signs to the contrary, in the dawn of a better world, I do believe. Amen.